That challenge may come in the future, and I would have absolutely no hesitation in going back. Those were the words of Brendan Rodgers just a couple of years ago when he spoke to Sky Sports, and it's almost like he was looking through a time machine. Brendan Rodgers could be returning as Celtic manager. He could be appointed as Celtic manager before this podcast goes out. He could be appointed as a manager while we record this podcast. He may not be appointed as manager today, tomorrow, Sunday, or Monday. Who knows? But Alan Morrison, you were right to go so heavy on the Brendan Rodgers train on last week's podcast because it looks like old Brodge might be coming back to his old stomping ground.
Yeah, I thought that quote that you gave at the beginning, I thought you were talking about James and 20-minute Tim's there. Yeah, listen, it's looking likely as far as we can tell. It's taking a long time, but this is probably in many ways a record-breaking package that Celtic are putting together here for their new manager. A salary the likes of which we've probably never seen for a manager, a substantial transfer budget, which, to be fair, would have been available to Postecoglou in any case, and therefore you have to assume would be available whomever finally ends up being the manager if it isn't Brendan Rodgers. And also a commitment to a series of infrastructure and capability improvements, which Rodgers was crying out for when he was here originally, and which again had been promised to Postecoglou in any case. So it's a big decision. It's a big undertaking. It's a big commitment. But I think that I think attention has been drawn to the fact that next year, 23-24 season, the Champions League expands essentially for teams like Celtic, with the potential for significantly more matches. I think that the pot increases as well. I think I read somewhere there's a potential for Celtic, even if they didn't get in, if they maybe got into one knockout game, you're looking at, whereas now you're talking about 25, 30 million, you could be talking up to around 50 million. And therefore, that tends to focus people's attention. People like Dermot Desmond, who's very focused on the bottom line, in terms of what is needed to create a Celtic that's going to be able to get to that level. I'd like to think as well at the club there's been a growing realization that Celtic are lagging behind major clubs as far as their capabilities and infrastructure. Yeah, I hope that is that realization. That is the case, and therefore something has to be done about that. So, listen, I think we're on the cusp of something remarkable, potentially, and we obviously will wait to see what gets finalised. But this could be the start of quite a change in gear, shall we say, in terms of what happens going forward.
Yeah, so it definitely seems like the club are prioritizing continued success over potential sort of risk bringing in another, let's say, developing manager like Ange, because it was a risk to take Ange on. We developed his career and he moved on. Whereas Brendan Rodgers has had success at Celtic already. He's had relative success at Leicester City, winning the FA Cup, narrowly missing out on the Champions League spots, which was overachieving with a club the size of Leicester, regardless of, the Premier League title that they won a couple of years ago. And with Swansea, when he was there, he had success. With Liverpool, that's probably where he failed, but that job probably came a little bit too soon as his CV. But James, this seems to be a return to not the norm at Celtic, but a more Celtic approach to management, to appointments. It wouldn't surprise you if Celtic went for this, again and again and again, if it proves that Celtic win trophies, they get into the Champions League. And regardless of probably the further development of what maybe we thought Ange was going to build, the manager is going to be someone who's going to be trusted, essentially.
We discussed this last week, I think, which was kind of it looked like the competing camps were not dissimilar to the last managerial. That was more of an odyssey, with the Dermot Desmond preferred candidate and Eddie Howe, and then the pivot towards the City Financial Group, apparently, when that collapsed. And, you know, the rumored candidates, the two prominent ones that seemed to emerge as time went on kind of fit that. And I don't think you guys, either of you guys listened to it, but Graham Spears has a Patreon podcast that I subscribe to. And he had one this week with Harry Brady and I think Paul from Celtic Quick News, and I forget the other guy. He's a journalist from the Herald, but McGarry, I think maybe. But I apologize to that individual. I don't remember their name. But Harry Brady mentioned, you know, and Harry's pretty well connected. That you know, I want to give him full credit on this. That because this is where I heard it, was that Brendan Rodgers was pretty adamant about not coming back, and then Dermot Desmond got a hold of him. And apparently Dermot has a reputation of being fairly persuasive, as Harry characterized it. So I think this is clearly a Dermot Desmond path. And again, the history that would fit, good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, it just kind of seems like the way it's playing out. And he has pretty much, I think, been clear about his preference for this kind of old school manager as God operating model. And again, can debate about the relative wisdom of that, but that looks like the path that we're going. So, you know, I think there's positives and negatives to all of these things. To Alan's main point about the short term, I agree. Like I think Rodgers is the clear top candidate as far as achieving objectives for this season in particular, and probably for next season. So the next two seasons, what it means for long-term infrastructure and competitive balance and recruitment and all these other things, I think are, you know, interesting topics and worth discussing and considering longer term. But as long as Desmond is a major power player at the club, it just doesn't seem that those things are going to be prioritized over what he thinks is the best path to proceed. And again, I tweeted about this today. I mean, it's not like the guy's a maniac. I mean, I argue there's some confirmation bias here, but you know, he wanted Eddie Howe, and now Eddie Howe's going into a Newcastle side that's done very well. I think it's to a large degree the $500 million that's been spent. But you know, it's not unreasonable to say, oh, Eddie Howe's a good manager. Like his instincts, you know, he had the Martin O'Neill experience where he kind of went for the big name and gave him a lot of money and back him, and that turned out pretty well. So, you know, you can see why he's going down this path. I disagree with it longer term, but if he's going to do it, like I think Rodgers, in the bigger scheme of things, is probably about the best that we could hope for, particularly relative to competing in Europe.
Well, money talks, really, and you mentioned the Champions League money, Alan. That is definitely a big factor, but also in terms of paying Rodgers, I think if you look through the list of managers out there and sort of the relative ranking of them, Rodgers is probably the highest ranked manager that Celtic can afford to get in reality, because he is a manager that would be managing a club between the 10th and 7th, maybe the 6th top club in England. That's probably the highest that Celtic are going to get, because in reality, Celtic's manager went to one of those clubs in Tottenham. So it's a very interesting move in so many different ways. And we will talk about sort of the pros and cons of this in terms of the style of play, what he's going to bring. And I'm just going to act as if Brendan Rodgers is appointed. I know that's a dangerous game given what happened to Eddie Howe, but let's just pretend that Brendan Rodgers has been appointed, and we'll get to all the tactical stuff and this stuff that people come to listen to this podcast for. But I want to stray from that for 1 second on it, because the thing that excites me most about Brendan Rodgers, it isn't the style of play, it isn't the trophies, it isn't, you know, thinking what he's going to do. It's wondering what kind of way is he going to apologize for leaving the club? Because, or the question it really is, does he need to apologize for leaving the club in the way that he left it? But secondly, what is he going to say? Because he's got something planned. He's already working on a speech. That's probably why he hasn't been appointed yet. He wants to make sure that he has that speech written before he gets announced as the Celtic manager. So in a non-huddle breakdown sort of way, let's discuss the juicy elements. Does Brendan Rodgers need to apologize to Celtic fans for the way that he left the first time?
Well, if there isn't a country and western song called, there's no easy way to lose your lover, then there damn well should be. Because as we think we've seen, there is no perfect way to leave if you're going to get a higher paid, higher profile job, which is what's happened in the case of Rodgers previously, and Postecoglou now as well. It's I think we'll all be absolutely astonished if it ever comes to out in the open exactly what the terms that Rodgers is coming in on, and it's a very strange way to treat someone that you think needs to apologise to. I think I'll leave it at that. For me personally, I honestly don't feel the need to be apologised to. All these comments from what I imagine are in all other respects fully functioning adults around making analogies between somebody cheating on your wife and then, your wife cheating on somebody and then taking them back, and all this sort of infantile rubbish. I'm sorry, I just can't be doing with all that. This is business. There are a lot of structural reasons which we've alluded to as to why Brendan Rodgers left. In fact, I think one of the myths about Brendan Rodgers is his capriciousness. I mean, he did a good job at Swansea. He got a once in a lifetime. I don't know, but he got the job of a lifetime to go to Liverpool. He was there for nearly 4 seasons, right? So I think in this day and age to manage to keep that job as high profile as that for that length of time is excellent. I'm astonished he was at Celtic for nearly 3 years, given what happened at the end of the first year, given the debacle around the so-called promises to Boyata and Dembele, the damage that caused internally to morale, what seems to then have happened in terms of the control of the recruitment process. I'm amazed he stayed as long as he did, in all honesty. So it's for me. And then Leicester City, he nearly lasted 4 years there. So this isn't somebody that ups and moves every year and gets cold feet. This is somebody who seems to want to get involved in a project and see it through. So there is no ideal way to leave, especially partway through a season. I could play to play devil's advocate. We were 8 points clear when he left, and Lennon did a decent job in getting us over the line. Leicester weren't in the relegation zone when he left, and they ended up getting relegated. Right, so no, I'm not looking. I don't feel the need for an apology personally. That's my view, and certainly, as I say, the terms upon which he's coming back suggest that Desmond agrees with that, because I suspect the issues were elsewhere.
Well, I mean, James, outside of the sort of joking element of whether he's going to apologize or not, I mean, there is a real sort of point in all of this, in that one of the key reasons he left when he did was because of the previous summer, when he wasn't backed in the way that he was promised, and he had already reportedly fallen out with the board. He had already reportedly sort of mentally switched off from what he was doing because he just wasn't getting the support he felt he deserved. And now he's coming back to a club that seems to be backing the manager a little bit more. At least that was based on the evidence of what they did for Ange. So you'd imagine he's coming back, if he is appointed, on the promise, and it is a promise that he thinks that the club are going to keep, that they will back him in the way that they backed Ange and the way that they didn't back him previously.
Yeah, it's fun to do these kind of alternate history exercises, kind of the man in the high castle. Because Martin O'Neill flirting with Leeds. That kind of got that story and timeline got a light shown on it again recently because of Ange leaving. And if you go back to an alternate history that Martin O'Neill, in the end, there's a reason why people remember some of this stuff, is because we want to keep these people in good stead, right? You want to remember the good stuff long term. But when you go back kind of contemporaneously and look at actually what happened, it's stuff like that, hey, maybe almost went to Leeds, or the fact that part of why he came to Celtic is because Dermot Desmond basically underwrote 1.6 million pounds in a preferred share offering directly to Martin O'Neill that paid 6%. Right. So the guy was very well compensated to come to Celtic at the time, and he flirted with going to Leeds. So does that mean that he wasn't a great manager, or that the history isn't what it was? Of course not. But, you know, these fairy tales that we like to tell ourselves, who was a Celtic man and who's not a Celtic man, and all this stuff. These people are professionals with careers. And, you know, if Martin O'Neill almost left to go to Leeds, you know, I think that puts it into perspective as far as what the modern game even 20 years ago was, let alone where we're at now. So I'm also a jaded a-hole American, where, you know, our sports culture is a lot more mercenary anyway, and grew up in it. So I've had less of that kind of impulse in how I view players and managers, just as a result of that. So I never kind of buy into that. I see all of these people as, you know, as closer to professional wrestlers as they are, you know, like true people. I mean, there's literally an entertainment part and an acting role that they play, because it's in their incentives. I mean, why would you come into Glasgow and not do any of this, playing at Rangers or Celtic? I mean, why would you make your life miserable unnecessarily? So of course you're going to kind of play the role. So no, I actually think his biography, I think is more believable with Rodgers, actually. Like, I think he actually does have an affinity for the club. And again, I didn't think that Ange didn't have an affinity for the club. But is it enough to overwhelm like how they're going to run their careers, and particularly if they're not having a good work relationship with their direct boss, like you know, Rodgers seemingly didn't at the end stages in his last trip. So I don't hold it against them. I never did. You know, some of the rhetoric about him, you know, him being a rat and all that stuff, like, I get it. A Judas, all that stuff. Like, I get it. That's what fans do. Like, I'm not going to claim that I never had that thought go through my mind in the emotion of the moment, because it was, you know, not a fun time for him to be leaving when he did it. But, you know, that's part of the emotion. That's part of what makes it, you know, perversely fun. That's the highs and lows that we go through.
I'm not calling him a rat or any way, shape, or form in that aspect of things, but I do think he's a shy talker. Like, as much
they all are. Ange was
a
a shy talker too. That's the point. Ange was a different kind of shy talker, and people just bought into it because here's the threshold. If they've written a book about themselves, you know who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a pretty good threshold.
Brendan Rodgers, there's if you want to like just like a good laugh, just go on to YouTube and look up Brendan Rodgers' funniest quotes, because
that's the David Brent
like,
stuff. I get it.
He's amazingly David Brent. But look, that's all beside the point. The more important thing is what he's going to do on the pitch. And somebody asked me like what the reaction is going to be with Celtic fans about Brendan Rodgers coming back. And I mean, the thing is, right, there might be some people out there that will hold it against him. That will end as soon as Celtic beat Rangers in the Old Firm or in the Glasgow Derby. So, you know, like, football fans are as fickle as, okay, we didn't like what you did there, but you've come back now. You're winning games. If you're winning trophies, Celtic fans are going to forget about this very, very quickly. So I think what he does, what he gets the team to do on the pitch is probably more important and what we probably should be talking about on this podcast. So let's talk about that, because I think it's a really fascinating way to think about this appointment, because there's similar values to the way that Ange plays and the way that Brendan Rodgers plays, but in many ways they're vastly different managers. Brendan Rodgers is very much a slow build up, possession based game. Ange is a fast, direct, hit them as quickly as possible sort of manager. So Alan, like the players that are at the club, I would say are probably more suited to the Brendan Rodgers way of playing, because we have spoken about the way that some of the players don't actually suit the Ange way of playing. But if you think of, the way that Cal McGregor has developed and evolved since Rodgers was last at the club into a number 6 who's really good at taking the ball out of defense and linking the midfield to the forwards. Matt O'Reilly is an exceptionally talented midfielder on the ball. Has had a really creative but often quite risky, and takes the dangerous option more often than not. And then you have players like Jota on the wing, very similar to the likes of Scott Sinclair in his directedness and the way that he likes to get on the ball. And I know that Brendan Rodgers, his style of play has evolved since he was at Celtic last, but it is still fundamentally a possession-based build-up. Do you think these players, would you agree with that these players that he's coming in to take are probably more suited to Brendan Rodgers' ball than Ange ball?
I don't know if they're more suited. I don't have any great concerns about any of the players really fitting in. I mean, the only one that I would slightly wonder about would be Aizen Maeda, because again, he's got such a specialist skill set. Now, Rodgers likes to press the opposition high as well, and Maeda is probably elite level in the world. Talking elite level in the sport, sorry, in that particular skill. He really is. He's like Jeremy Frimpong in his ability to carry the ball quickly up the pitch. Maeda's world class skill is actually his pressing and his counter pressing, and for that alone, he's going to have a very good career. Because Jeremy Frimpong is going to have a fantastic career. Rumors of him going to some of the biggest clubs in the world on the basis of one world-class skill, right? And I'm not trying to downplay it, but Jeremy Frimpong wasn't a scorer of goals. He didn't create many chances. He didn't have many tricks. He wasn't a great defender. He's not very good in the air. He was just phenomenally fast and good at getting the ball up the pitch. And that one super skill is going to be enough to get him a gig at an elite club. And Maeda, I think, falls into a similar category in that regard. His weaknesses are his technical ability. He'll blast past people. He'll get beyond defenders if you time the pass correctly. He's a pretty good finisher, and we've not seen a lot of that because he's not been playing central. I think that's an underrated part of his game. But given Rodgers' approach would be a little bit more possession based, a little bit more waiting for the right moment in the build up, and looking for that little spark of creativity from your wide players, he's the one player that I wonder, has he got that in him to be that unlocker of defences rather than relying purely on pace. But it's not a massive concern because, as I say, I think he'll still fit into other aspects of the way Rodgers wants to play. In all other regards, the other one that we'll come back to that will be interesting will be Joe Hart, because again, we're in a very similar position to when Rodgers came in the first time, when we had Craig Gordon. Now, I think Craig Gordon was an exceptional goalkeeper. I think Craig Gordon was nearer at his peak than what Joe Hart is near to his peak, if you see what I mean. Joe Hart's further from his peak than Craig Gordon was. So Gordon was a very good shot stopper. Gordon was also a little bit arsey, my view, about being asked to play this sweeper keeper role, and really seemed quite reluctant about it and never seemed to really embrace it, whereas Joe Hart has thrown himself absolutely into it and absolutely done his best in that role. So it'll be very fascinating to see, because remember, Rodgers brought in Doris de Vries to replace Gordon purely on the basis of ability with the ball at his feet. Now, that was a disaster because the guy couldn't keep the ball out of the net. And that was quickly discarded. So at least he didn't persist with the mistake. But that's the one area that I think is going to be very interesting, is the goalkeeping situation, in terms of if you want to start off with thinking about personnel. But in all other respects, I don't have any massive, because we're not really talking about a revolutionary shift here. We're still fundamentally talking about possession-based football. Keeping the ball away from the opposition, pressing hard when you lose it. The subtleties are really around, the directness of the passing, let's call it. But also, I think, and we'll get into this maybe, I'll just tee this up for the sort of the conversation, is I think Rodgers comes back as a manager with more strings to his tactical ball than what we had previously, and certainly more so than Postecoglou, who was avowedly not going to change the way he played.
On the Joe Hart point, Joe Hart isn't massively dissimilar to Kasper Schmeichel, with the exception of ability to come out and claim the ball for corners and being proactive in that sense. In terms of his actual on the ball ability, I would say Joe Hart and Kasper Schmeichel are fairly similar to, the Kasper Schmeichel that was at Leicester when Rodgers was there. But James, I guess I'll throw the same question that I threw to Alan to you, because I know that this has been something that you've been very to the point about, that the players that were brought in weren't suited to the way that Ange wanted to play. Do you think they're more suited or similarly suited to the way that Brendan Rodgers is going to want to play?
Yeah, so I think about it through the lens of kind of optimization. So again, this is all from an analytical perspective. So I think, and it's obviously a spectrum. So my concerns about the Ange era was the optimization of the squad relative to competing at the level that we wanted to, playing his style of play in Europe. Right. So that very specific, that was how Hatate Gate started. That's how all, this whole conversation about him. So that's always kind of the general lens through which that I'm viewing these things. So when I apply the same kind of lens, I'd say it's probably a little bit less of an issue, just because the risks of Rodgers' style of play in Europe are not as severe. But I think we're still lacking to a material degree on that optimization. And I think, and I can't do an impression of any person, but particularly of a Northern Irish accent. But, he was fond of talking about pace and power, right? That's kind of, and if you look at generally how he's recruited, I'm not a big EPL fan. I haven't followed Leicester that I've returned to looking at Leicester a little bit because of the news the last couple of weeks. But, generally speaking, they went for pretty big, fast, athletic people. That seems to be his bias. And that is not our squad, right? Like that is, pace and power is not how we recruited. So, I wonder how he's going to view the squad, not only from a quality perspective coming in relative, but all, again, I got into this, and I'm actually a fan of the 20-minute Tim. So, but this was the exchange that it had this week, was talking about, what we didn't know it at the time, but relatively speaking, there was a lot of pace and power in that squad that he inherited back from Ronnie Deila. Some of it had to be developed. No question about that. And you should get credit for that. But there was raw material there. Kieran Tierney, even, Christopher Iyer went out on loan. Like those are guys that had pace and power. And the way that he liked to play, Stuart Armstrong, like these guys kind of met that criteria. And then the way he recruited, the ones that were pretty clear his, or the ones that he liked, in particular Sinclair, or whether it was, in Cham or Edouard, or, even DeBelly, which, obviously overlapped a little bit, seemed to have been in the pipeline anyway. That kind of fit that as well. So how does that going to end up? That's the good part, is there's going to be a lot of resources here, right? So if he wants to make some changes, I think that he's going to be able to do that with some degree. And this gets into the conversation about structure and his recruitment track record and all these other things. But I wonder how much, change he's going to actually want. I agree. Like there's some other issues that I have a bigger concern about with Rodgers, but the keeper position continues to be one. And again, if you go back all the way to Deila, even, and this is part of the other thing I put in my thread that ended up with the interaction this week, was, his last campaign that failed in his last season. I mean, Craig Gordon had a big role to play in that. Like he was maniacally bad. And I agree with generally. Like he was a good shot stopper, but coming off his line, and some of the, we used to joke about his karate kicks when he'd come out sometimes off his line when there was one-on-ones with guys that got, through balls, and there was a cluster of that in that group. So this issue of keeper play in Europe at Celtic has been a major issue. And it hasn't been fixed. Hart did not improve that situation. And DeVries sure as hell didn't.
No.
And So, I still worry about, what's the decision making going to be there? Because to me, it really is a seminal part of, no matter what the game plan is, if we're going to compete against pot 1 and pot 2 teams in the Champions League, or that quality of club that ends up dropping into the Europa League, and we're trying to win a trophy, which I think should be the aspiration, winning the Europa League, it's going to require an excellent shot-stopping keeper. And I wrote a piece about this earlier in the year about how Club Brugge got out of the group in the Champions League, and Mignolet basically stood on his head in the group, and he was able to do that. He's an older keeper, but he's a terrific shot stopper. And so that, to me, and if you look at when we have had success in Europe, kind of since Strachan, who played a more, we'll call it cynical style, it's Fraser Forster. I mean, every single, whether it was Barcelona or the Lazio group, it was because Fraser Forster basically won those games. So I think there's a recipe there, and I'm still worried that we're not addressing that issue.
Do you want to hear my impression of Brendan Rodgers? Because I'm not
Please.
I'm not too far away. So
Please.
I need something to say. So maybe whose phone's ringing? So a little bit of pace, a little bit of power. Sounds. He talked a little bit low like this. He likes kind of like that. Went a little bit cork there. But I'm wondering what James McCarthy is going to do when he meets Brendan Rodgers, because I think we all know where that went. Do you remember the James McCarthy thing when he went weird? Just look it up on Twitter. If you haven't seen the James McCarthy Brendan Rodgers thing, it's so weird. It's so funny, and it's going to be so weird when the two of them meet each other. He could be a player that could come back into the team actually under Brendan Rodgers. He's good on the ball. He likes to play a simple pass. Who knows what's going to happen next season? But I guess I'll give you the option of going for a pro or a con of Brendan Rodgers, and you can tell me which one you want to go for and explain it.
Well, I can do both if you want.
Okay, well, we'll go for a pro first, and then James, I'll let you go for a con, and then we'll switch it back.
Okay. So we're going to be defensively stronger. So Postecoglou never really hid the fact that he didn't. I mean, he kind of played. This is playing to the gallery again. This is playing his role and his act, right? He did actually tweak the team significantly. He did tweak the team to make it defensively more solid as his 2 years went on. And if he says he didn't, he's being disingenuous. Having said that, we still kind of are up there around 1 xG and 1 goal conceded per game over the 2 years, right? Which, if you think about Celtic's dominance, especially domestic, that's quite incredible, actually. That Celtic should be conceding that number of goals. Now, the European football distorts that, and in Europe, that became nearer 2 to 2.5. It was like extraordinarily high. So under Rodgers, it was always less. Now Rodgers, won't have the same aggressive attacking philosophy, or hasn't done hitherto. But he made Leicester more of a counter-attacking team. And he even, had 5 at the back, 3 at the back, 5 at the back on occasions. It might be to do with the strengths of the relative players that he had. And he had a lot of success against some of the top 6 sides in playing this. He had pace in the team, and he had some strong central defenders, and he played a style that we wouldn't have recognised from his days at Celtic, where it was very heavy sort of possession based. So I think I agree with James. I think, given the level of investment that seems to be on the table for the next Celtic manager, and given the fact that if he can reinvest whatever he sells, and I think I agree with James. I think there's some good assets in our squad that might not be quite as powerful and athletic as we would like, that would nevertheless generate some decent transfer income. If that gets reinvested to up the levels of pace and power in the team, whilst maintaining the technical levels, then I think we'll start to see the potential for better European performances, especially, and because simply we'll just be that much more solid defensively. The opposition number of shots within the box, number of entries into the box, overall XG per shot, all those things were much lower under Rodgers than they were under Postecoglou. So if you want a pro, it will be that we will become that bit more defensively solid.
It's in Europe as well, because I mean, history would tell you otherwise. I mean, there's
I can rebut that.
I think
I'm locked and loaded on that one, Alan. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll let you go. I'll let you go for that because I know you've looked at it in probably more detail than I have. So you go for it.
Yeah. So some of that. Let's first of all, I mean, the context is always important. So Ange inherited a mess. The first season, entering Europe, things were not all that settled. But the fact is, against pot 1 and pot 2 clubs in the last 2 European campaigns, we averaged conceding 3.25 goals per game, right? So when Alan talks about this skew, there's a financial market term, options markets and stuff. It's the skew of our performance under Ange has been insane. Meaning that the amount that we conceded goals against higher quality opposition was alarming. And Alan's talked about this, that it could have been a lot worse. And this goes back to why I take umbrage with the characterization on Rodgers' first tenure in Europe. Is not only was the first 2 campaigns Champions League versus Ange having, Europa League and Champions League, but the groups, the relative quality of the clubs in those groups, I would argue, were higher. And like, if you look at some of the pastings that we took, the 7-0 against Barcelona, for example, that's the peak Messi, peak Neymar Barcelona, and we had Doris freaking De Vries in goal, right? So if you actually look at the chances that were created in those games, if you look at the XG and the quality, the XG per shot, that kind of stuff, the Madrid game that we just lost 5-1 this past season was way worse than that 7-0. I mean, if Benzema was playing in that game and was hot, right? It could have been a 10-1 kind of. I mean, that's what Alan's talked about this. When you start conceding 2.5 and higher XG against these level of opponents with the kind of finishing that can happen in bursts, right? Because finishing is quite volatile, and that's basically what we faced also in the PSG game. Again, the PSG had Mbappe and Cavani. The guys, some of these finishing. Cavani doing flying headers from 12 yards out. I mean, you don't see that in the SPFL very often, right? So, and so this is why I go back to this issue of having a quality keeper. So if you have world-class finishers that you're facing and you're giving them a high volume of chances, and you don't have a world-class shot stopper, easy for me to say, that's how you get this, these horribly lopsided outcomes. And again, if you look back to the Gladbach games, even the Man City games, and I would argue the second season, the Bayern Munich games, those were all very competitive games. So these couple of really lopsided results, I think, skew the narrative on how competitive we were under Rodgers. And again, this is with me saying at the time, the recruitment wasn't great. We weren't a modern club at that point. Like, we could have done a lot better. And yet he was still able to, put us in a position where I thought we were competitive against vastly superior talent with quality managers at most of those opponents. And that also, again, if in isolation, you'd say, oh, well, maybe. But again, he went on to Leicester and did some of the stuff at Leicester with a kind of similar circumstance, which is good players, but not of the level of the competition, and really competing by punching above their weight. So to me, that's kind of the actual European track record under Rodgers, and why I'm more optimistic.
Okay. Well, I think that's a fair point. And in terms of the con then, so what's your biggest fear?
Well, there's two. One is, how's this all going to shake out relative to recruitment and the power center, and how all that plays out. And again, that's where we really don't have a great idea because of all the mess that was going on last time. all the talk about Congerton and the dynamics with Lawwell, and there's all this rumor and innuendo, and we just have no idea of how that all shook out. He had a kind of mixed record. This is probably a concern because Leicester actually has been fairly progressive in infrastructure, in recruitment and various other things. So, the fact that his track record there in recruitment may not be great. It's been okay, I think, reasonably to say. There's been other financial issues there because of the owners and the pandemic, but so I'd say that's some worry there. The bigger one, actually, to me, comes back to cultural, which is injury risk. He's a throwback British manager in a sport that's still in the dark ages for the most part relative to certain fitness issues, head injuries, for example. We're still kind of, awareness is better, but you still get some just ridiculous decisions that are made where people should be taken off, obviously, because they've experienced the trauma. To me, that's summarized. Well, first of all, there's data behind this, meaning that if you look at like days lost to injury, his tenure at Leicester, he was in the bottom, tier of consistently outside of his first season, which again, that is, this comes to this issue that some of the stuff wears on people over time. And he typically substitutes less. He flogs his players. And he has a track record of, maybe playing people hurt when they shouldn't. And I mentioned to you guys before we went live, and to me, that's epitomized by Kieran Tierney's appearance on Open Goal back in I think it was August of 2020, when he went through. I mean, go back and listen to the interview. He, in an honest, good faith way, recounted his experience at Celtic. And if you listen to that, I don't think you can come away not being impacted by the degree with which he was doing things that he absolutely should not have been doing in order to try to keep playing, and that it jeopardized his long-term health. It caused him to incur serious damage that required a long period of time not playing. And that most of that period was under Rodgers, where taking painkiller injections, this kind of stuff. So to me, that's a cultural issue. And I was critical with Ange, not to that extent, but, playing Kyogo against St. Johnston when he had a hamstring issue, and then he ruptures his hamstring in the cup final and has to have surgery, which, by the way, that's not speculation anymore. He showed it on he showed the scar from the one documentary that he made, that he had to have surgery to reattach his hamstring. So that was just an asinine decision relative to risk. So there's a moral argument about duty of care and that kind of stuff. That's separate. It's you have high valued assets as a professional manager of a club, and to jeopardize their long-term health and their value as players because you're just not being smart about these, fitness issues, I think is problematic. And again, this comes down to not only value, but availability, right? If you're flogging guys and you have a big fixture coming up and people pull up lame, so there's, from a resource optimization perspective, Celtic are not going to have the depth of quality inherently to compete at the level that we want to take systemic injury problems with any kind of, significance. So that would be, another issue, which is we have a track record. The club has shown a problem with kind of, imposing discipline on a risk management perspective, and he has not looked like he's evolved in that regard. So to me, that's an issue.
In his defense, I would say that it's sort of an industry-wide thing more than a Brendan Rodgers specific thing. Like, there are countless examples of managers doing this, and I would well say that it is more down to the players doing it as opposed to the manager. I know that there are definitely managers who will want their players back quicker. Jose Mourinho is notorious for, almost shunning players who are on the injury table and coming back from injury, and they want them back as soon as possible. But I also know that there are players out there that will force themselves back if they're able to play through the pain barrier. They will play, and they will want to play, and they will tell the manager that they want to play. And there should be pushback. There should be more pushback, I guess. But if you have a significant drop off in the quality of replacement for that player, let's say it's Kieran Tierney, if that player comes to you and says, boss, big game coming up, I know I'm semi-injury, I'll take a painkiller, I'll be fine, I'll play through the barrier, and he's able to give you a performance that's still better than your replacement, you're probably going to take that. And I think that's probably an issue more wider within the football industry than it is a Brendan Rodgers specific issue.
No question. I agree with that. I think it's an issue of degree, meaning that, I'm not some choir boy. So, someone taking an injection to play in a cup final where it's, an ankle or, it's something, a cracked rib, right? Where you're not going to incur structural risk of long-term damage that's, kind of irreversible to a degree. So that to me, that's normal. That's a kind of a normal part. But when you have someone, in a league campaign where you're really not under significant risk, like we were in 18-19, we like to pretend that league was close at certain points, just like some of the campaigns under Dial where, Aberdeen's within 10 points at some point. Oh, well, there's a title race. There really wasn't much of a title race. And you're going to flog Kieran Tierney taking painkillers away to, Ross County, right? To me, that's where you're doing long-term damage to somebody. So it's a matter of dial here. And so that's the concern, right? I'm not saying it's going to happen again but the other thing, this is why I was so critical with Vange when it happened with Kyogo, is that there was reporting done, and I've heard that the club have invested in some things like machine learning to identify injury risk. And then when people have these tools at their disposal and ignore them, that speaks again to culture and not being smart, right? So is Rodgers going to come in? So this going back, I would assume Leicester are a well-run footballing operation. I don't know if they have the exact same kind of risk management tools, but will he come in and maybe be enlightened by the tools at his disposal? I hope so. But I think so far the track record suggests that I think it's reasonable to be concerned that he might not. So that's, you lose players for 3-6 months when these kind of injuries happen. So if you have tools at your disposal to reduce those risks, I think it's crazy not to use them.
Just to finish off on the point of painkillers and playing through injury, I knew there was a report done very recently. It was done a couple of years ago by the NCIS, and it found that 71% of the players playing in the World Cup said that they had played at some point while on painkillers, and 60% said, so 444 players out of 736 said that they had taken painkillers at least once before a game, and nearly half of the players said that they were taking some sort of medication in the 72 hours before their team's match, regardless of whether they were playing or not. So, I mean, this is an endemic. It's something that chickens are going to come home to roost at some point in world football. So it is a serious problem. I don't think it should be downplayed, the impact that the amount of games that these players are playing, regardless of whether they want to play. Alan, I'll let you come in now then. So you mentioned better defense or more control in games, especially against higher opposition in Europe. What are your concerns then for Rodgers if he does come back?
Yeah, so I think we've got used to the last 2 years of an ever evolving effective attack. 114 league goals is incredible. Ange spoke about how he just loves scoring goals. Goals are the best thing that happens in a game, and wants to see more of them. We scored 3 league goals per game. The attack became increasingly effective at the domestic level in terms of our ability to pretty much swat aside any configuration that the opposition put out there, in terms of whether it's a back five, a back four, deep block, medium block, counter attack, two men up front. It didn't matter. We found a way to score, create a huge number of chances against that. That you know that and the sort of XG differential was just ridiculously high. It got to between sort of 2 and 2.5 per game, meaning Celtic were generating between 2 and 2.5 expected goals per game more than their opponents, which seemed to be enough to negate nearly all the negative variance that you could get around bad decisions, penalties, sendings off, injuries, etc., etc. There was so much difference, so much more attacking threat that Celtic carried versus the opposition. And some of that was to do with the five sub rule. As much as it wasn't really an Ange thing, it was just the way that football's gone in terms of the deployment of resources, and therefore Celtic being by a distance the most financially secure and richest club in the league, were able to deploy more resources in a game. It's as simple as that. Which, as I say, will be true for Rodgers as much as it will be true for Postecoglou. When you look at Rodgers' time at Celtic, that differential that I talked about, that was between 2 and 2.5. With Rodgers, it was between about 1.5 and 2. So an order below really what Postecoglou was able to generate. So to give you some context, that's nearer to what the Rangers were operating at last season. So you've got more potential for variance to have a negative impact on that. But what might be surprising to people, especially given how obviously Rodgers kicked off with the invincible season, and then there's a sort of narrative that the next two are a little bit more stodgy. Actually, that is true to some extent, but also we became that defensively more sound the longer that Rodgers was here. That actually the XG differential grew over Rodgers' tenure, such that it was higher at the beginning, trending higher at the end, of his tenure than it was at the beginning, and that might surprise people. Whereas with Postecoglou, it was the reverse. The XG differential was narrowing the longer that we played Ange ball. So, I'm saying it's a negative. I think we'll have less all-out thrilling attacking play. I mean, the attacking patterns that Celtic had in domestic football were exceptional, were exciting. We should thank Ange for giving us those 2 years of thrilling football. I think we'll be dialing back on that a little bit, but I do think Rodgers is a manager who, the more time he has with a team, the better I think he can make them. Whereas I think with Ange, there is some evidence to suggest that the longer you stick with Ange, the demands physically especially are so great that perhaps it tails off a little bit. The sort of no trophies in the third season is an interesting stat. But also Ange doesn't tend to hang around as long as Rodgers does, which again, most people probably don't want to hear in terms of a narrative, but it's factually true.
Can't not win a trophy in your third season if you're not there for a third season. He's
well,
just one
there
step
you
ahead
go,
of everyone else.
So
just finally, then, before we finish up, the overarching feeling, I guess, of disappointment of how things have been done, how things have been dealt with. The fight over John Kennedy is just phenomenal stuff. That man must just be the greatest football brain since Pep Guardiola, because my God, he's in demand all the time. The general feeling after, no, it hasn't gone through yet, James, obviously, but general feeling of disappointment in the next couple of months, because we've all been spoiled over the last number of years under Ange, in that he came in, got straight into business, the transfers were done quickly, everything was just smooth sailing pretty much, in terms of the way that things were run. Results came after a shaky start, but it was pretty much just smooth sailing from about September of his first year onwards. Is it business as usual at Celtic? Do you think there's going to be some interruption? Are you apprehensive about the summer ahead, or what's your general feeling now with Brendan Rodgers seemingly being the man?
Well, so there's the supporter side, and then there's the huddle breakdown content side. So the supporter side is actually, I'm very excited. Like, I actually think, because again, I've made no secret of my near obsession with Europe, and that's where my aspirational fulfillment lays as a supporter. So that I'm we've talked about that over and over again on this show, that and I think Alan shared it to a large degree, this kind of festering anxiety about how this was going to scale to next season's Champions League and whether it would, and if it didn't, how calamitous that could be from a kind of, that kind of thing. So as a supporter, I don't have a lot of the baggage that I understand other people do. Like, I get it. It's reasonable. As I said, I don't judge anyone for feeling the way that some people obviously do about him returning. So I'm very excited from that. From a huddled breakdown perspective, I am ecstatic because, to be honest with you, Ange Ball got boring analytically because it was so consistently good in a certain way, right? It was basically every week, well, they're going to play the St. Mirren game plan or not, and then how much are we going to rip them apart if they do or they don't? I mean, that was really the formula analytically to a large degree domestically.
Don't give away our secrets.
Right. I'll sum this up, just a quick stat. So, as we always say, formations are dynamic and there's some fluidity to it. But, Y-Scout does kind of break up games based on shape. What's the primary system that a team's playing? And we were overwhelmingly 4-3-3 under Ange, right? With a couple of other iterations at times, but it's like, 75, 80% in his 2 years. We were 4-3-3, and really only played like maybe two other for the most part. Rodgers in all of his seasons, whether you go back, that we have data on, back to, kind of 15, 16 at Liverpool and then forward, consistently 11-13. Okay. So he's gonna play three at the back at times. He's gonna, go 4-4-2 diamond. He's gonna make tactical adjustments mid-game, doing all kinds of different things, which just analytically is, I think, more interesting. Good and bad. Like, there'll be times he blows it. That's just by definition what happens when you tweak things. But to meld those two things together, I think he's the most interesting manager that we've had, both as a supporter and analytically speaking. I mean, I think he's of an echelon of a brain, and I was very complimentary of Ange, but I think he was very kind of, that Bielsa kind of almost religiosity of style of play. And I think Rodgers is at the same or even maybe a little higher level intellectually, but more of a problem solver. As opposed to, more physicist and less priest when it comes to football. And to me, that'll be interesting.
How about you, Alan?
So I feel like I need to probably go back again and reiterate that, I didn't start from when Ange left. And by the way, I just saw a tweet from Etim saying it was only last Tuesday when Ange left. Right, and the board knew the Thursday before that he was going to leave. So it's only been really just over 2 weeks for the recruitment of the most important executive in the club. So let's just cool our jets in terms of impatience. That's not a ridiculous amount of time to recruit such a complex role. Is that I'm not going to pretend that I wanted Brendan Rodgers above everybody else, all things being equal. We've arrived at this place because we started the conversation based on what the bookies said. These are the candidates, right? So that was the population upon which we gave an opinion. And the reason I picked Rodgers, again, is because, I just see so much risk in the way that the club is operating in this recruitment process. And I saw so much risk if we don't get it right for this season because of the Champions League restructuring, because of the money on offer for winning the league this season, that the only way to de-risk the incompetent recruitment process and the prize at hand was to recruit the safest pair of hands that was available on that list. And that's why I went with Rodgers, for that reason. And why is it incompetent? It's incompetent because essentially, our major non-executive shareholder has once again decided to take, front and center the role of chief recruiter in this process, and has decided from his big Rolodex of, British and Irish names that Brendan Rodgers is the one that's available on top of his list. This is an analog billionaire. He has a Rolodex and a private jet and lots of money. right? And what Desmond wants, Desmond tends to get. In the meantime, we've got a City football group, dyed in the wool data person over here saying Maresca, Maresca, Maresca. Now listen, it's not a bad thing for a football club to have healthy debate, different opinions about a key role like this. Absolutely normal, absolutely healthy. But should your major non-executive shareholder be leading the charge on the recruitment? I don't think they should. Should your chairman, non-executive chairman, be running interference on the whole process? I don't think he should. So it's a nonsense, frankly, and it's unprofessional. I believe a lot of it, in my opinion. Therefore, de-risk it. You could end up with Rodgers Rodgers' name, and that's why I've gone with it. So, having said all that, I'm super excited if it is Brendan Rodgers, but I'm more super excited that, again, I don't know why. I don't know what's happened behind the scenes, but somebody's woken up our billionaire shareholder, and he's now suddenly super engaged to modernize the football club, seemingly, and to back the manager and to build a more modern facility, infrastructure, and squad. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out, to be more competitive in Europe, to be more modern, so that if we can get that Champions League money, can we get the sort of director of football type role in place, the other heads of department who are senior enough to keep the thing moving, such that the manager appointment isn't this big drama that Desmond has to lead. It just becomes a pretty sensible process driven by knowledge of the culture, knowledge of the way that Celtic play, etc., etc., etc. That's what I hope happens on the back of all of this. But it's driven not from a healthy place, in my view.
I fully believe a man with that type of mustache has an old style Rolodex as well. I fully buy into that. I don't think he might not even be operating off email. Who knows what he's at these days? But yeah, look, it has not been confirmed yet. One interesting aspect of this, and this is my final point before we end the podcast, is just the weird sort of merry-go-round between Leicester and Spurs and everyone who's operating in this sphere, because Ange's left for Spurs. Maresca was supposed to come to get the Celtic job. Brendan Rodgers, I know he left Leicester a while ago, but Brendan Rodgers has left Leicester to take the Celtic job. Maresca is apparently taking the Leicester job. John Kennedy has refused to go to Spurs to meet Ange, but Davies, who was Brendan Rodgers' assistant, is going to Spurs to be Ange's assistant now, and John Kennedy's staying in Celtic to work with Brendan Rodgers. It just all screams a little bit of like lack of imagination at board level at all three of those clubs, but it could also mean that all of those candidates are the best kind of candidates as well. Who knows? But
what you've just described, wasn't that apes the beginning? Wasn't it? What's that old American sitcom? Was it like called Soap? I think it was a rip-off of sitcoms, wasn't it? It was called Soap.
Yeah, it was.
And I think the
it was Billy Crystal.
Exactly
Yeah,
exactly like that. Yeah. Yeah, as I said to you in message, and you could argue that that sort of cross fertilization of individuals between clubs means that all clubs are looking for a very similar profile of people. But I suspect I'm being very generous.
Yeah, I suspect that too. Look, if you are watching on YouTube, let us know in the comments what you think of the Brendan Rodgers appointment. Tweet us either at Huddle Breakdown. That's where you can get us on Twitter. And you can get our podcast on Spotify or iTunes. And if you're on iTunes, be sure to rate the podcast and leave a comment about it, because it helps boost it in the algorithm as well. We'll be probably continuing the conversation around Rodgers and management and Celtic's future over the next couple of weeks. We do also have that Kieran Maguire interview that we're sitting on. That'll probably, I've been promising it for a couple of weeks now, but I promise
this is worse than Al Capone's vault. This is worse than Al Capone's vault. We're going to have to get Geraldo de Rivera in here to unleash this thing.
It's going to have to be the best damn interview you're going to ever see, because we've been holding on to it for so long. But I promise you, if nothing happens between now and next week, we will release the Kieran Maguire interview that we've recorded and is in the bank. And that probably covers a lot of the topics that we'd be speaking about in terms of backing Brendan Rodgers and the money that's there and the gap between Celtic and Rangers as well. So I'll bring that to you next week, I promise you. But until then, James, Alan, thanks very much for this week.
See you guys.
And we'll chat to you next week. Good luck.